All right, guys, let's take a look at how we can implement UI streaming and loading states from the server in Next.js. I've already got an example app here. I've just created an example dashboard, and I've assumed on every single page of this Next.js app, there is some sort of data fetching. Now, I have mocked this. I've just added a 5-second timer, but I want to show you if we don't use any UI streaming and things like that, then every single page is going to take 5 seconds to load. So for example, if I click Get Started, it's going to take 5 seconds before we then get navigated to the dashboard/my profile page. And it's exactly the same for each of these pages within the dashboard. For example, if we click on subscriptions, it's going to take 5 seconds. We can see the tab loading here. It's going to take 5 seconds before we then get navigated to subscriptions. Exactly the same for billing info and exactly the same for settings. Now, there is a way better way we can handle this scenario. So instead of having to wait for every single page to load its data, what we can do is first load all the UI that doesn't require any data fetching to the browser first, and then we'll stream in the response for any components or any pages that need loading. For example, this My Dashboard section, so the left-hand side panel here, this could be loaded to the browser instantly because this entire section is going to be exactly the same for every user of our site. So this could be quite easily displayed first in the browser, and then we'll load our pages in the appropriate section on the right-hand side here. So let's take a look at the code for this. I've just got a very basic page layout here. And what's happening is for each of the dashboard pages, so let's test out my profile, I've just added a 5-second timeout to mock some data fetching. So what's happening here is because my profile is taking 5 seconds to load some data, then the layout for the dashboard, which is responsible for rendering all the links for our dashboard, is also being delayed. So this is blocking the loading of our page. Now, to get around this, we can do it one of two ways. The first way is on a per page basis. So for example, my profile here, all we need to do is add a loading.tsx file, and let's export default function loading. Then we could just return ideally some skeleton, some nice bit of looking UI, but I'm just going to say loading ... here. So what's going to happen is the left-hand side panel now is going to be loaded instantly, and then the My Profile page is going to show loading ... before then, once our data fetching resolves, before then rendering my profile. Now, it's important to note that this file has to be called loading.tsx or loading.js. It doesn't really matter. It just has to be called loading because that's how Next.js knows to display this loading state while it's waiting for this particular page to resolve. So if we head on back to the browser then, if we click on My Profile now, we can see that My Profile loads instantly, but we display loading for 5 seconds while we wait for our data to fetch. Then we display My Profile. So let's take a look then. If we head on back to the homepage, and now if we click Getting Started, we can see my dashboard, this left-hand side here, loads instantly. We have our loading state, and then my profile data is loaded in afterwards. However, there is another way you can implement this type of behavior. So for example, on individual components. Let's say, for example, on our dashboard here and our left-hand side dashboard panel, we want to display the currently logged in user's username or email address or something like that, which does require some data fetching. Now, of course, we're going to have to do this in the layout file for our dashboard route. So if we head on back to our code, within the dashboard and layout.tsx file, it's within here that we're going to have to load the user details. So at the top here, I'm going to add, first of all, I need to change this into an asynchronous function. Then again, I'm just going to mock this. So I'm going to add a 5-second delay. So let's say await set timeout, which we need to import from timers/promises. And we're going to add a 5-second delay to mock the data fetching for the currently logged in user. And I'm just going to say const username equals Tom. And then just under my dashboard, I'm going to say something like welcome back and then the username like this. So if we save this now and take a look in the browser, if we give my dashboard or the dashboard page a refresh, we can see welcome back Tom. But if we refresh the page, it's going to take 5 seconds again for this entire page to load. Now, it's going to be a lot more obvious if we navigate back to the homepage and then click Getting Started, and we can see it's taking 5 seconds again because we're loading in the dashboard layout. So to get around this, we can create a component which will be responsible for loading the user details. So in the root directory of my project here, I'm going to add a components directory, and in here I'm going to say user profile.tsx. Now it's within this user profile. Let's go export function user, and actually it needs to be async. So export async function user profile. And we're going to do exactly the same thing here. We're going to await set timeout 5 seconds. And this needs to be imported from timer/promises. Let's grab the details then. We're going to have const username Tom, and we're just going to return welcome back, followed by the username. And we need to return this. So we've just moved all of the functionality to grab a user's details into a new user profile component. So within our dashboard then, underneath my dashboard here, first of all, let's remove this set timeout where we're mocking the grabbing of the user data. Then we want to render our user profile component. So if we save this now, nothing is actually going to change because this user profile component still takes 5 seconds to load, and it's still going to block the rendering of the dashboard layout. So let's confirm this. If we head on back to the code, let's give the dashboard/my profile a refresh, and we can see it's actually taking 5 seconds for it to load. However, what we can do is wrap, if we head on back to the code, we can wrap the user profile component in a React suspense component. So anytime we do this, if we render a suspense component here, which we need to import at the top of our file from React, we need to import suspense from React, then render user profile within this suspense, we can provide now a fallback. So this could be a string, it could be any HTML markup or other React components. However, I'm just going to add a div in here and say something like loading user ... So what's going to happen now is, because we've wrapped our user profile in a suspense component, it's no longer going to block the rendering of the dashboard layout. And instead, it's going to render the loading user before then rendering the user profile. So after the user profile has finished loading, this loading user message will no longer display and will display the user profile. So let's confirm this. If we head on back to the code, first of all, I'm going to navigate back to the home page. Then let's click getting started, and we can see it's instantly loaded, and we can see our loading state for the user details, and we're no longer blocking the rendering of common sections of our page anytime we're trying to fetch some data. Now, a brand new feature in Next.js 14, and we need to use the Canary version of Next.js, and the feature is partial pre-rendering. So what we can do instead is, instead of server rendering this side section here, we can pre-compile this into static HTML. And then anytime we render suspense components or we have our loading states for particular pages, those will essentially be holes in our static HTML, which will then be filled by the data that comes back after we fetch the data within those components. So to enable this, it's really easy. All we need to do is head on back to VS Code, and let's move my head out here. We need to open up next.config.js, and we just need to set experimental and PPR set to true. So anytime we add this, all those common sections of our site are going to be rendered as static HTML. So we're not server rendering this. This will already be precompiled as static HTML. Then all the areas where we have suspense and our loading states will essentially be holes in our static HTML, which will then be loaded in. The UI will be streamed in afterwards. Now, this really reminds me of Astro's island architecture. However, it's slightly different in the context of Next, but you get the idea. So that's a very basic way we can set up UI streaming and partial pre-rendering in Next.js.